Okay, thank you very much. Right, so I recognise I represent the barrier between all of you and lunch, so I'll try to be brief yeah, hopefully. Okay. Oh, well, okay. Well, I'll just take half an hour then. Okay, no, carrying on. So we've already touched a lot today about business continuity and really trying to put controls in place that allow business continuity to go on as much as possible. And I really want to focus on that, thinking about movement control for outbreak scenarios. I mean, we all know this, but generally movement restrictions are put in place to try to reduce transmission of disease. I'm going to take very much a UK perspective, but really the same is true for most disease-free countries around the world. Now, in the UK, current policy would be that if there is an outbreak of FMD, movement restrictions would be put in place at a national scale. Now, there have been instances where if risk is deemed to be low, those restrictions might be relaxed after a period of time with no cases. Now, I'm sure probably most of you, if not all of you in the room, are familiar with the UK 2001 outbreak. Since this talk is UK-centric, I'm just going to give you a very quick overview of the outbreak just to put into context the problem. So this was what the timeline of cases looked like in 2001. The disease entered the country in early February. The peak occurred round about late March, early April, and it was characterised by this really long epidemic tail that actually lasted until about the end of September, about 3 foot off my graph at the far end. It was hugely devastating. There were about 10,000 farms were affected, either infected with disease or culled as part of the control policy, and there were nearly 1 million cattle and 4 million sheep were culled. So it was hugely expensive to the country, and I'm going to show some of the costs in a minute. Spatially, the outbreak looked something like this. There were 2,026 premises were infected, and there were major hotspots of the disease in Cumbria in the north of England, which is shown there in blue. Really bad colour, but I'm sorry, yellow, which you can't really see, but you can see the circle down there. So that's Devon, where there were nearly 200 infected premises. These two counties I'm going to show results of from our model later on, so take a note of where they are if you don't know your UK geography very well. Wales, which is over towards the west, where we had again about over 100 IPs, and the Scottish borders, where we had around about 200 infected premises. So as I said, in the UK, nationwide controls are introduced regardless of the location of the outbreak. Now, unfortunately, in 2001, there was a bit of a blunder made by the UK government that when they decided to put in movement controls around the country, they announced it and they said, in 48 hours, we're going to ban movements nationwide. Now, of course, farmers being farmers moved all their animals very quickly, and it caused spread around the country. Now, in 2007, when we had our next outbreak, we'd very much learnt our lesson. So nationwide control came in place quickly. The outbreak itself in 2007 was really small. There were only 9 infected premises. And in that situation, the single biggest cost of the outbreak was owing to the movement restrictions that were in place and the loss of business continuity. So this is what we want to think about and what we're going to think about in this talk. So I'm going to talk about the economics. So in 2001, the costs were sort of broadly split into 5 main categories. I will say I'm not an economist. I'm sure someone could say that these aren't exactly robustly everything that should be considered, but I'm broadly putting them into 5 categories. The first one is direct cost to the farmer. So any kind of compensation costs because their livestock were culled, any kind of disposal costs. And in 2001, that was about £3 billion. The second cost was owing to welfare cull, where animals were culled because they weren't being able to get feed out to them. And that came up to about 0.2 billion. There were various costs to the wider agricultural sector through losses of trade and so forth. And then there were export costs. And finally, costs to the tourist industry because the countryside was closed, basically. And that actually outweighed all of the other costs directly to the farming industry. So this nationwide movement ban was directly responsible for an increase in several of these costs. Now, of course, I will, with the caveat there that this nationwide movement ban may have significantly reduced the outbreak size. So there is a trade-off here. So what I want to ask here is Are these nationwide movement bans always justified? Is it always better to minimise the risk of movement? Or can we get away with more localised movement control? So what we're going to do here is we're going to use our Warwick FMD model that was used in 2001 and has been used a lot since then to simulate this economic impact of regional control. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do before I show you the results is show you how we calculate the costs. Now, we had a slightly heated discussion after the first session this morning about assumptions from models. And what I'm going to say to you here is, don't believe these costs that I'm putting up here. That these are average costs that we're putting into our model, and I'm going to talk about these and I'm going to show sensitivity to these later. It's really important that we don't just rely on the single cost that we're quoting. So, that said, the initial assumptions that were made are given here. So the direct costs are essentially proportional to the total livestock culled. And we come up with rough estimates from the literature of what the compensation and disposal costs for cattle and sheep are. Welfare costs are essentially proportional to the number of farms per day that are subject to movement restrictions. And again, from the literature, we can come out with a daily farm level cost for that. Agricultural costs are proportional to the total number of movements that are prevented because of movement controls. And then we have the colours here actually make sense because they're going to be the same colours as I'm going to show you in the results later. I'm not just trying to do pretty rainbow pictures. And then we have export costs that are essentially proportional to the length of the export ban. And finally, tourist costs that are proportional to the scale of the outbreak. So all of these apparently plucked out of thin air random numbers have been estimated from the 2002 Anderson Lessons to be Learned inquiry from the 2001 outbreak, but I'm going to show sensitivity to these later. So, as I said, I'm not claiming that these are the exact numbers. Okay, so the Warwick model itself was originally used in the 2001 outbreak to predict local spread. And I'm not going to go into any huge detail, but broadly, the risk of infection is essentially proportional to how infectious your infected farm is, how susceptible your susceptible farm is, and then some kind of distance factor, which broadly, entirely non-mathematically, is the closer the farm, the higher the risk. It's common sense. If you're interested in the maths, and I'm not going to talk about this at all, but you can break it down into something like this. If anyone wants to know the details of this, feel free to talk to me after. The final important part is this transmission kernel, which I said weights infection based upon proximity. And the kernel looks something like that. However, we're also modelling movements as well as local spread. So we want to think about the transmission risk according to movements. So in order to do that, when a farm is reported, we're going to consider the following options. Firstly, we're going to consider no movement control whatsoever, so business can carry on as normal. Secondly, we're going to consider banning movements within a certain radius of infected premises. And finally, we're going to consider what is currently being done in the UK, which is a nationwide movement ban. So in order to do that, over our model, we're going to overlay all the movement data that we have, and this just shows you a movement network for Wales, just as an example. So all of these data we can access freely from the UK cattle tracing system and the animal movement licence scheme to simulate transmission risk via movements. Okay, so what do the results look like? So as I said, I asked you to keep an eye on Cumbria and Devon, so we're going to seed outbreaks in these two counties. And then this graph just says, as we increase the radius of the movement ban, as we go in the X direction, what's the overall cost of the outbreak? And as a comparison, the final bar shows you the cost of a nationwide outbreak at the end. And I said these colours had a reason, so I'm just breaking it down by the different types of costs here. And what this tells us is that actually the optimal, if you're looking at minimising costs here, is relatively small radius movement bans around all farms. About 20 kilometres here proves to be optimal. If I compare that with Devon, Well, what I actually find, apparently people don't like going on holiday to Devon as much as they do to Cumbria. The tourism costs are significantly lower in Devon than they are in Cumbria. And the result of this is we get a slightly higher radius movement band being optimal. That said, the really key thing to take here is the jump in costs if we have a nationwide movement ban, which implies that some level of business continuity could be beneficial. Now, as I said, this relies on the very specific values that I put into those costs. So we're going to look at sensitivity to that. And in order to do that, we've created a Shiny app, which actually is live. So if you want to have fun playing around with this, you can go to that web address and you can do your own sensitivity analysis. If you open it, it looks something like this. So this just shows you the graph that you saw before, with all the costs broken down here on the left of the different parts of the industry. And we can then look at sensitivity to our results. So if we think, for instance, tourism is going to be a lot cheaper in the UK than it was before, then we can shift the bar and then it replots the graph and shows us the impact of that. If, for some bizarre reason, sheep become significantly more expensive than cattle in some kind of weird alternative universe, then we can replot that and again we can see the effect of that. Maybe post-Brexit no one exports animals anymore because we're not allowed. We can set that to 0 and we can replot the graph. So we can do all of these different types of analyses. We can also select a county, so we can replot it as the source of the infection changes. And I'm not going to talk about these at all, but we've done similar analyses for bovine tuberculosis and blue tongue virus. So you can go to this and you can, if you have an idea of the costs you want to consider, you can look at what the optimal policy might be. Right, so I mean, that's really all I wanted to talk about here. I'm really interested in people's views on this. The evidence suggests that for future outbreaks, it may be cost effective not to ban movements nationwide. But what we will say is that the scale of any movement ban appears to be highly dependent upon the region of introduction, the priorities, and what we believe are the overall costs. Now, the interesting thing here is, of course, you've noticed with those graphs that the reason it was really skewed was because of this large indirect tourism cost. But even if we take that out, we're still getting radial movement bans being more cost effective than the nationwide movement bans. So even if we're purely looking at the direct costs, it's more beneficial not to ban movements nationwide. And of course the advantage there is that in the case of regional movement bans, farmers that are not immediately affected by an outbreak can effectively operate as normal. So there is certain political advantage and sort of economic advantage to be gained by this sort of policy. Okay, that's all I wanted to say, just to thank my collaborators at Warwick, Naomi in particular, who designed the very cool Shiny app, and Ellen's done the work on bovine TB, and Sam has done the work on blue tongue virus. Okay, I'm done. Thank you very much.